You can't let the absence of complete information paralyze you or become your excuse for not leading. Now, what if you do understand it and you still don't agree? Then you need to remember something important. And this is going to sound really harsh, but here we go. Unless it's your name on the door, some decisions aren't yours to make, even if you want them to be, even if they impact you, and even if you think you have a better idea. When you work for someone else, that's part of the game.
Welcome. You're listening to This Leader, the podcast. If you lead people and are seeking the transformational, high-impact secrets that will lead to greater joy and fulfillment in your work, will optimize your team performance, and will help you create a happy, highly productive workplace, then you are this leader and you're in the right place. I'm your host, Claire Laughlin, and each week my guests and I will explore the mindsets, techniques, and actionable strategies that will help you build the career, team, and organization of your dreams. Because I believe no one should have to suffer in a dysfunctional workplace. Let's get started.
Hello there. Wow, I have been getting so much feedback from the episode a couple weeks ago on leading change. I had to address this. I've had people reach out and say to me, "Hey, Claire, this is great. Like the 4P framework makes sense. But what about when people resist anyway? Or what about when I do everything right and people still push back? Or what about when I'm trying to lead this change and it feels like I'm dragging people along?" I hear you. I really do. Because I've been there. I've been on both sides of that leadership dynamic. And I've been the leader that's trying to get people on board. And I've been that resistant person. So let me tell you about a time when I was that resistant person. Several years ago, I was working for a manager who I really, really respected. He was smart, supportive, a great leader in so many ways. And one day, he proposed a full reorganization of our department, and he wanted everyone's input. So he called a series of meetings to work through this together. So here's the thing. I totally trusted this manager, but I did not understand why we really needed to do this reorganization. I didn't understand how we would actually do it. I didn't understand why it was important now. And I didn't understand what I could or should contribute to the conversation. The whole thing just felt incredibly vague to me. And honestly, it seemed to me like it had very little chance of actually being implemented. Plus, and this was a big factor, it was going to mean a lot of long meetings that, frankly, I didn't feel like I had time for. So you know what I did? I sat through all those meetings. And I just kind of disengaged. I didn't speak up about my concerns. I didn't ask very many clarifying questions. I didn't contribute very many ideas. I just remember feeling like this was a huge waste of time. And my manager, well, he probably experienced my reaction or my presence as pure resistance. But really, looking through my lens, I was confused, I was overwhelmed, and I just didn't know how to engage constructively from that place. I didn't have the leadership courage at that time to say what I was actually thinking and feeling. And looking back now, I can see that both of us probably could have done a little better. He probably could have been clear about the why and the why now, and perhaps could have laid out a roadmap for us, right? Looked at the whole process a little more carefully in terms of the chances that this thing had for success, and maybe even provided a more structured way for each of us to contribute, because there were a lot of us in these all-day meetings. I could have spoken up. I could have asked the questions that were floating around in my mind. I could have expressed my reluctance in a constructive way instead of checking out. Maybe that would have changed the process in some way. So today, we're going to talk about how to deeply understand the many phases of resistance, because I know it can be incredibly frustrating. And we're going to talk about how to do better, whether you are the leader or the recipient of change, or even, as many of you have indicated, stuck somewhere in the middle. Okay, so first, let's talk about what resistance looks like, because many of you have chimed in and we've had these discussions. And When I say someone's being resistant, I just want to kind of clarify, like, what do we mean by that? How would you know if someone was showing up resistant? Well, here's a bunch of the behaviors that I've heard you say. Someone is zoning out in meetings or they're skipping the meetings altogether. Okay. They're not accepting the meeting invites, they're just opting out. Or people asking a lot of questions, sometimes the same questions over and over again, sometimes the same questions to different people at different times, which makes you think that they're sort of shopping around for the answer that they want, right? Maybe you've got a person who doesn't return emails about the project, doesn't contribute their knowledge, or doesn't participate in these planning conversations. Or maybe you've got someone who says yes to things, but then doesn't follow through. And then you become the person who has to like go after them and try to find the information. Or, right, there could be someone who's unusually quiet when they're normally engaged, or who gives short, curt responses like, well, whatever you think. Or someone who constantly plays devil's advocate, poking holes in every plan. Or they just withdraw with their body language, crossed arms, looking away, sighing, eye rolling. All of those can be signs. But here's what's important to understand. When you see these behaviors, you might react and think, oh, gosh, here's that resistance again. They're being difficult. But the truth is, you don't really know what's under the surface there. You don't know where those behaviors really stem from. You see the behavior, you interpret it as resistance, and it probably causes some frustration on your part, right? But the underlying cause could be so many things. It could be confusion about, like, why? Why are we doing this? Or frustration about not being asked for input somewhere along the path. Or could be a lack of trust, or simply a feeling of being overwhelmed and questioning that, like, okay, why now? Why do we have to do this now? Or maybe disagreeing with the direction, but not knowing how to voice it. There could be so many ways, so many sources, and we don't actually know. And that's why, as a leader, you need to get curious rather than make assumptions. You need to ask instead of interpret. But, and this is equally important, you also need to make sure that you're leading the way with clarity and empathy. So, remember what we talked about in the episode on navigating change that was earlier this month? Change produces a threat response for people. People's brains begin scanning for threats to their status, their certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Remember that SCARF model we talked about? So before you assume that someone's just being difficult, ask yourself, wait a minute, have I been clear enough about the why? Did I give people a chance to contribute? Am I acknowledging how hard this transition might be? Because sometimes what looks like resistance is just a normal response to change that hasn't yet been fully processed. So let's talk about where resistance typically comes from. Because in my experience, both working with leaders and being that resistant person, resistance usually comes from a few common sources. First, lack of clarity about the why. Like, people don't understand what is the real problem that is being solved. They don't see why the change matters, right? It's this connection to the purpose, the real purpose. That connection isn't strong enough. They don't know why it has to happen now, for example. Like, what's the burning platform? Why can't we do this later? And in the absence of information, they fill in the blanks with their own stories. And those stories are usually not positive. That was me in those reorganization meetings. I didn't understand the why now part. So I focused more on my own feelings of being overwhelmed with things to do when there may have been a very good reason that the reorg had to be addressed right away. Second, your folks could be feeling excluded from the process. Maybe people have ideas to contribute, but they weren't asked. They weren't included. And now the change is happening to them instead of with them. And that produces a threat response that comes out as frustration, anger, or something else. They might have had very valuable input, maybe even a better way to do something, but they felt shut out of the conversation for some reason. Third, sometimes they disagree with the direction. People close to the work likely have information or a perspective that leadership doesn't have. Maybe they see a fatal flaw in the plan. Maybe they know something about implementation that wasn't considered. Maybe they have a legitimate concern about whether this is actually going to work. And if there's no space for them to voice that disagreement constructively, it's going to come out as resistance. And by the way, listening to their input will probably make the eventual plan a lot more successful. So listen up. Fourth, there could be compromised trust from similar circumstances in the past. Or maybe the leader's being asked to sell something that they don't authentically support, and the rest of the team can see right through it. So when trust is compromised, everything becomes slower and more difficult. And finally, fifth, there's unrealistic expectations. Maybe there's a gap between what's being asked and actual capacity. Like you're asking people to implement a major change while they're already underwater, or you're asking them to do something that's simply not feasible with the current resources or on the current timeline. And they know it's not going to work. But when they say that, it sounds like they're making excuses. Now, here's what I want you to notice. All of these forms of resistance are actually rooted in legitimate concerns. It's not just people being difficult. It isn't just people resisting change because, they want to push back or just because, hey, change is hard. There's usually a real breakdown somewhere in the process, and we need to proactively address it. Okay, so if you're the leader, if you're trying to implement a change and you're encountering resistance, here's your roadmap. Here's what you need to do. First, and most importantly, do your work before you implement the change. Really think it through. Make sure that the solution you're offering up is a really quality solution, done for the right reasons, to solve the right problem, and at the right time. Make sure you understand the root problem and that you're not just putting a band aid on something. Really think it through. You'll be using up what I call your change leadership capital every time you ask others to come along with a new idea. So don't bring something half baked to your team and expect them to get all on board. Do the homework, consider the implications, vet the approach, or be super clear that, hey, this is just an idea and you want their input early. That's good too. In fact, and this is critical, just remember, include your people as early and as often as possible. The earlier you bring people in, the less resistance you're likely to encounter because they're helping shape the solution rather than just having it imposed. Now, I know sometimes you can't include people early. Sometimes the decision gets made above you and you just have to implement it. We'll talk about that in a minute. But when you do have the ability to include people, do it. It's worth the investment. Second, lead with clarity and empathy, my friends. This is where last week's 4P framework comes in. Purpose, picture, plan, and part. Actually, it was not last week, it was the week before. But be crystal clear about why this change is happening and why it's happening now. Why now is the time. Paint a picture of what's on the other side and what the journey through the neutral zone is going to look like, right? Remember, you got to be real. It's going to be a struggle, but also provide hope. Lay out the plan, lay out the timeline, the milestones, what happens next, or engage your team in the planning. That's even better. Give people a constructive part to play, a way to contribute, a sense of influence over what they can influence. Okay? When you do this well, you address a lot of what creates resistance to begin with. You're giving clarity, you're including people, you're creating space for different perspectives, and you're building trust through transparency. You're being realistic about what's feasible. Okay, third, stay curious when you see resistance. Don't assume you know what's going on. Ask. You can say, I notice you've been quiet in our meetings about this change. Tell me what's on your mind. Or, hey, you seem a little hesitant about this plan. Share with me, what concerns do you have? Or you could say, help me understand what it is that you see. What's making this difficult from your point of view? Give people space to tell you really what they're actually experiencing, not what you think they're experiencing, what they're actually experiencing. And then this is key. Really listen. Don't defend, don't explain, just listen. Because resistance is information. It's telling you something. Maybe it's telling you that you weren't clear enough. Maybe it's telling you that there's a legitimate concern you haven't addressed. Maybe it's telling you that trust is compromised and needs repair. Listen to learn. Okay, now I need to address something that's really important, something you've probably experienced. What if you're being asked to lead a change that you don't believe in? Oh my, I got a lot of these. What if the decision was made above you and now you have to implement it with your team, but you have your own doubts, you have your own concerns, your own resistance? This is the middle manager dilemma, my friends. You're both the leader and the resistor, and it's one of the hardest positions to be in. So let's talk about how to navigate this with integrity. First, you need to separate, I don't understand this from I disagree with this. If you don't understand the why or the decision making process, your first job is to go get that clarity from your leadership. You can't lead what you don't understand. So ask the questions. Say, help me understand the purpose here. What problem are we solving? What alternatives were considered? Who's the decision maker and how was this decision made or how will the decision be made? Get the information you need to make sense of it for yourself first. These were the questions I was not asking. I hope to encourage you to ask these questions. Remember, help me understand the purpose. What is the problem we're solving? What alternatives were considered? Ask those questions. Because here's the reality. Even when you ask, sometimes you're not going to get all the information. Don't let that stop you from asking. But yes, sometimes you're not going to get all the information. We know this. This is part of working in an organization. Sometimes there's confidentiality issues. Sometimes there's information that leadership can't share yet. Sometimes there's strategic reasons that you're not privy to. And you have to be okay with that. You have to be able to say, okay, I don't have all the answers, but here's what I do know. You can't let the absence of complete information paralyze you or become your excuse for not leading. Now, what if you do understand it and you still don't agree? Again, I got a lot of these. Then you need to remember something important. And this is going to sound really harsh, but here we go. Unless it's your name on the door, some decisions aren't yours to make. Okay? Even if you want them to be, even if they impact you, and even if you think you have a better idea. When you work for someone else, that's part of the game. You can advocate for yourself and your perspective, absolutely. And you absolutely should speak up if you have legitimate concerns. You should add your perspective and your information. But at the end of the day, if leadership makes a decision that's different from what you would have chosen, that's their prerogative. And honestly, even when you work for yourself, even when it is your name on the door, there are things that you obviously need to adapt to. Market conditions change, customer needs shift, competition evolves. I may not understand it all, but I still have to adapt. None of us has complete control. We all have to navigate change we didn't choose and we don't love. So here's what you can do when you're leading a change you don't fully agree with. First, find something you can authentically support. Maybe you don't agree with every aspect of the change, but is there something you can get behind? Maybe you don't love the solution, but maybe you can understand the problem that's being solved. Maybe you don't agree with the timeline, but you believe in the end goal. Find something that can make an authentic yes on your part. Find the part that you can genuinely support and lead from there. You don't have to pretend to think it's perfect, but you do need to find something real you can stand on. Be honest about what you don't know without undermining. So you could say things like this, like, okay, I don't have all the answers yet, but here's what I do know. Or, I have some of the same questions you do. Here's what I'm working to find out. Okay, that's genuine. Or you can say, this wasn't my decision to make, but I'm committed to helping us implement it well. Okay, be honest without being a victim or a persecutor. Acknowledge reality without undermining your own or someone else's leadership. What you can't do, or what you shouldn't do, let me say, is commiserate with your team about how terrible this change is. You can't position yourself as a fellow victim of leadership's bad decisions. I know it might feel like that's the easy way to go in the moment, but trust me, it's harder. It makes things harder because now eventually you have to lead the way through that path anyway. Okay. Because even if that's how you feel, when you do all that, you lose your ability to lead your team properly through the transition. You become part of the resistance instead of part of the solution. So ask yourself, how can I lead this with integrity? Not, do I love this change? Not even, do I fully agree with this change? But can I lead it, or how can I lead it with integrity? How can I find something authentic to stand on? How can I help my team navigate this? Okay. Do your work. Be honest about what you don't know while providing clarity about what you do know. And remember, this is what leadership looks like in the real world. It's messy, it's complicated. This is leadership. You don't always get the information you want or the decision you wish for. Now, let's flip this around. What if you're the one that's feeling resistant? What if change is being handed to you and you don't understand it, or you don't like it, or you were never asked? Because you can't control the way it comes down sometimes, right? How do you engage constructively? Here's what I learned from my own experience with that reorganization. Checking out doesn't serve anyone. Not you, not your manager, not your team. When you disengage, even partially, you lose influence. You lose your ability to shape what you can shape. You lose the opportunity to demonstrate yourself as a leader. And you might even damage your reputation in the process. So instead, you need to find a way to engage, even when it's hard, even when you're confused or frustrated or overwhelmed. Here's what I wish I had done in those meetings. I wish I'd said, hey, I'm struggling to understand the purpose behind this reorganization. Can you help me see what is the main problem that we're solving? And why is it important for us to tackle this right now? Like, that's it. That's all I needed to say up front. It's not accusatory. It's not passive aggressive. It's just honest and direct. So let me just give you some language for engaging constructively when you're the one that's feeling resistant. If you don't understand the why, you can say this. Can you help me understand the purpose behind this? What problem are we solving? Why is this important right now? Don't make up stories in your head about why this is happening. Just ask. If you weren't asked for your input, you can say, I have some thoughts on this. Is there still room for input? Like, don't sulk, don't disengage. Offer what you have to contribute. If you disagree with the direction, you can say, I have some concerns or a different perspective that I think will be valuable. Can we discuss it? All right. Frame this as adding information, not attacking the decision. If you don't trust the process or maybe even the person leading it, you can say, hey, I'm struggling with some aspect of this. Can you help me work through this? Be honest about what's bothering you. Don't be accusatory. Be honest and give them a chance to address it. And finally, if the implementation plan feels unrealistic, say, hey, I want to flag some capacity concerns or timing concerns. Can we talk through the plan and what's actually feasible? Don't just comply and then fail. Speak up about what's realistic and what's not. Now, here's what I want you to notice about all of these statements. They're not victim statements. They're not complaining. They're not passive aggressive. They're constructive, they're collaborative, and they're engaged. And if you listen to our previous episode on the drama triangle, you'll recognize this. When you engage this way, you're stepping out of the drama and into a much more empowering role. You're taking responsibility for your experience. You are contributing solutions. Sometimes you're challenging the process, but you're showing up as a leader, even if you're not the leader of this particular change. But remember, you might speak up like this and still not get the answers you want. Okay? Sometimes leadership isn't going to have a good answer for why now, or sometimes they're not going to have a clear decision criteria why the decision was made or when it will be made or anything. Sometimes they're going to ask you to implement something that genuinely isn't realistic. And then you have to decide how to move forward anyway. But you'll make a better decision from a place of engagement than from a place of resistance. When you've asked these questions, you've offered your input and voiced your concerns constructively, then you have the information you need to decide to do what's next. Maybe you'll get the clarity you needed and you'll feel better about moving forward. Maybe you'll realize you need to escalate concerns to a higher level, or maybe you'll find a creative way to make it work. But at the end of the day, you'll know that you showed up at your best And that matters. When I think back to that reorganization, I realized something. My manager was trying to do the absolute right thing. He really was. He called those meetings because he wanted input. He was very collaborative, very inclusive. And maybe I don't remember it clearly. Honestly, it was a while back, but I just didn't understand the why. Maybe he hadn't expressed it or thought through the whole implementation. I'm not sure, but I definitely wasn't showing up the way I wish I would have. We both played a role. And that's what often happens with resistance. It's not one person's fault, it's a dynamic, it's a pattern. The leader doesn't provide enough clarity or inclusion, probably not on purpose, but resistance increases. And then when people resist, the leader gets frustrated and either pushes harder or gives up. And around we go. So here's what I really want you to take away from today. If you're leading change, remember, change can be hard. Do your work before you implement. Include people as early and as often as possible. Lead with clarity and empathy, and stay curious when you see behaviors that you interpret as resistance. If you're in that middle space, like you're leading change that you don't fully believe in, find what you can authentically support. Be honest about what you don't know. And remember that this is what real world leadership looks like. And finally, if you're the one that's just feeling resistant, remember, checking out doesn't serve you. Engage constructively. Ask the questions you need to ask. Offer what you have to contribute. Show up as a leader, even if you're not the leader. Because change is hard, transition is uncomfortable, and we need each other to get through it well. Okay, so that wraps up this little impromptu mini series on change. We've talked about how change affects you personally, about how to navigate it. We've talked about how to lead your team through change using that 4P framework and how to navigate resistance today, both in your team and in yourself. I hope these conversations have given you some tools and perspective for whatever changes are coming your way, because change is constant. But how you lead the way through it? Well, that's where you make your mark. Thank you for listening. As always, please share this episode or this little series of episodes with others. And please head on over to Apple or Spotify and leave me a 5-star review. I really appreciate it. And that's how we get the word out. So until next time, go lead the way, my friend.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode. To learn more about my services and for lots of free resources and additional tools to enrich your journey, visit my website and subscribe to my newsletter at clairelaughlin.com. If you have a question about leadership, teams, or organizational culture you'd like me to address on the podcast, please reach out to me at support@clairelaughlin.com and connect with me on social channels @ClaireLaughlin Consulting. Until next time, lead the way.